Hello, and welcome to The Secret Sits. On today's episode, we will be discussing a rarer form of true crime stories, but one that is fascinating nonetheless. This story includes literary giants, the FBI, and famous celebrities from old Hollywood. The only problem with this is that these luminaries had no idea they were even involved. Today on The Secret Sits, we are going to delve into one of the most famous literary forgers in history, Lee Israel. Now, before we dive headfirst into the crux of Lee Israel's crooked deeds, let us look back and view her accomplishments that led to her more deviant lifestyle. Israel began a career as a freelance writer in the 1960s. Her profile of Katharine Hepburn, whom Israel had visited in California shortly before the death of Spencer Tracy, ran in November 1967 edition of Esquire magazine. Israel's magazine writing career continued into the 1970s. In the 1970s and 80s, she published biographies of the actress Tallulah Bankhead and the journalist and game show panelist Dorothy Kilgallen, and the cosmetics tycoon Estee Lauder. The Kilgallen book was well received upon its publication in 1979 and appeared on the New York Times bestseller list. Novelist and book reviewer Rita Mae Brown told readers of the Washington Post in 1979 that Kilgallen had expressed much curiosity about Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby, despite the prevalence of show business gossip in her newspaper column. Brown added that Israel's book deserves to be ranked with serious biographies, just as its subject deserved to be ranked with serious journalists. Despite the possibility that some political movements would probably find even the mention of Kilgallen's name a cause for hilarity. In her 2008 memoir, Can You Ever Forgive Me?, Israel claimed that in 1983, 4 years after the Kilgallen publication, she had received an advance from Macmillan Publishing to begin a project on Estee Lauder, about whom Macmillan wanted an unauthorized biography, warts and all. I accepted the offer, though I didn't give a shit about her warts. Israel also claimed that Lauder repeatedly attempted to bribe her into dropping the project. In the book, Israel discredited Lauder's public statements that she was born into European aristocracy and attended church regularly in Palm Beach, Florida. In 1985, Lauder wrote an autobiography that her publisher timed to coincide with Israel's book. Israel's book was disparaged by critics and was a commercial failure. I had made a mistake, Israel said of the episode. Instead of taking a great deal of money from a woman rich as Oprah, I published a bad, unimportant book, rushed out in months to beat Lauder's own memoir to market. After this failure, Israel's career went into decline, compounded by alcoholism and personality that some found difficult. So Lee Israel is an independent writer and quite a skilled one as well. Her biographies could have propelled her into the stratosphere of the top writers in the United States of America. However, Lee Israel was not an easy person to get along with. She was a hot-headed and brassy woman who did not take shit from anyone, which also meant that she did not necessarily play well with others. Lee was imprudent with her money and Dionysian to the quick. By this I mean she was foolish with money and was much too wild and irrational with her professional life. After her biography on Kilgallen, she took off many months to just play. And during that time, she met with and fell in love with a bartender named Elaine. Because of this meeting, she took off more months to continue playing. She had several false starts on other projects, which she quickly abandoned. Because of this, Lee had to constantly repay advances she had taken for these projects. She had to return her entire advances, even though she had funded research for these projects, only to determine that they were not doable. There was just no story worth pursuing on some of these subjects. Lee was down to her last $500 when she was offered a job by Macmillan to write a biography of the famous Estee Lauder, a colossus of the fragrance and cosmetic industry. Lee accepted the offer because she had no other option, but she had no attachment to the material. But before she could even say gift with purchase, Lee received another offer, this time from Lauder herself, through her attorney, Roy Cohn. Cohn communicated this offer through a mutual friend named Jack Hawk. The first offer made to Lee was for $60,000, enough to settle her back-owed taxes and pay back the rest of her advances for work she had never completed. Lee initially refused the offer, and she was sent the following message: "Tell Lee that the old lady said she can name her price." Lee did not trust this offer and made a final refusal for the project. So instead, she did the Estee Lauder book for Macmillan, which was rushed out because Estee Lauder was racing to market with her own autobiography. This is when Lee Israel realized she had made a mistake. Instead of taking a great deal of money from a woman rich as Oprah, I published a bad, unimportant book rushed out in months to beat the other little piggy to market. The reviews were terrible, and the sales were even worse. The Estee Lauder book was the beginning of the end for Lee as a hotshot writer. Over the course of 3 years, Lee plummeted from New York Times bestselling author to being on welfare. She began taking temp jobs as a legal proofreader at various law firms around New York City, working on the graveyard shift because the pay was better. Lee started to supplement her meager income by selling off some of her books, which lined the walls of her studio apartment. She often took them to the Strand bookstore on Lower Broadway. The Strand counter was manned by a tall, reedy man who had all the warmth of Dick Cheney. Lee and the clerk had had more than 20 or 30 transactions between them, and he had never once greeted Lee. Perhaps it had not occurred to the man that people selling their cherished items were the backbone of his business. One day Lee left her apartment, her arm aching of arthritis, carrying an armful of books to sell on her trip downtown. She only had enough money for a one-way trip, but was confident that her armful of treasures would bring at least $8. On this trip, however, the store clerk was more glacial than ever. He glanced up at the pile of books and said, "Not interested. Take them to 4th Avenue. Maybe they'll give you something there." And as Lee began to gather the books back up, she knew she couldn't carry them any further and turned to leave. Just then the Strand clerk shouted, "Hey, get your garbage off my counter," to which Lee swung her arm around and knocked the books to the floor. She was ejected from the Strand and barred from re-entering, closing one of her last sources of disposable income. Now in the throes of desperation, Lee began performing a series of what we will call prank phone calls. Loaded up on gin, she would call someone up who had once been her friend, but now was in, quote, meetings whenever Lee called. She would call a second time, this time being more professional and pleasant, and she would identify herself as Nora Ephron. This time her confrere would come to the phone with a warm, "Hiya, Nora," and Lee would shout back at them, "Starfucker." "Is that one word or two?" And she would hang up. After a time of this prank, Lee received a letter from Miss Ephron's attorney, and 2 detectives showed up at her apartment using words like harassment. Lee promised to cease and also desist. Flies made an appearance in Lee's apartment in early 1990. This was a bit of an anomaly because traditionally, Upper West Siders do not get flies, they get roaches. Lee had no idea where the flies were coming from. Lee had a 21-year-old cat named Jersey who was infirm and addled with age. The cat spent most of its time hidden under Lee's bed. coming out to eat small amounts of food and partake in just a little water. The local neighborhood vet told Lee that Jersey was in no pain and would probably pass in her sleep. Lee found no connection to the flies and the litter box, which had been her suspicion. It turned out that Jersey had been doing her business under Lee's bed, which was attracting the flies. Lee had smelled nothing, rather like a serial killer who covers their home with human parts but never seems to be bothered by the stench. Lee contacted her building super, who tried to get an exterminator to treat her place, but he had taken one look at the state of her apartment and refused to enter it. Lee began writing occasional pieces for Soap Opera Digest about old-time radio soaps like Ma Perkins. The money was scant, but she was having fun writing the articles. She would go to the library for the performing arts at Lincoln Center to do her research. One day while there, she requested material about Elaine Carrington, an old-school soap writer who was huge in her day. In the box, Lee found a clutch of letters from Fanny Brice to Carrington. Now, if you do not know who Fanny Brice is, she was an American actor who starred in the Ziegfeld Follies and then many productions on Broadway. 13 years after her death, she was portrayed on Broadway by Barbra Streisand in the 1964 musical Funny Girl. All of Fanny's letters were on note-size personalized stationery. Lee knew that these items should not have been given to her out in the general public area of the library, because a letter signed by Fanny Brice had some value to it. Celebrity-signed letters were a relatively new idea of income to Lee. She had not ever really thought of it as an option. Lee had recently found a tortoiseshell kitten with a face of half burnt orange and half black. She named Doris. Jersey had died peacefully in her sleep a few weeks before. Doris quickly stopped eating, and cats can do themselves mortal danger if they fast for too long. Lee took her new kitten to the local vet, Dr. Moses, but because Lee had repelled everyone around her away through her drinking and mean-spirited antics, Dr. Moses refused to see Doris unless Lee could pay up front. He knew that if he didn't get paid then, he would never be paid for his services. So Lee went back to the library and stole 3 of Fanny Brice's letters. There was no shortage of autograph dealers in New York. Argosy, autographs by Gary Combs, Cambridge, Essex, Lionheart, and David Schulson among them. Lee chose and called the most conveniently located dealer, the Argosy bookstore, located across the park from Lincoln Center. And they were interested in Fanny Brice letters. She was met by Naomi Hampel, who asked if she was the Lee Israel. Hampel offered $40 apiece for the letters, explaining that she would be able to pay a higher amount if the content of the letters was more interesting. Lee took a taxi home, and when she arrived, became jubilant, because without the visit to the vet, Doris had licked her entire bowl clean. Lee then purchased one of many manual typewriters, a jet black Royal, old enough to have been used by someone Fanny's age. Lee returned to Lincoln Center and took more of the Fanny Brice letters. She would now jazz up the letters with Hampel's words in the back of her mind. Lee embellished the letters with saucy postscripts. Her Fanny Brice note, with improvements, came with a hefty price tag of $595. Lee immediately intended on growing her newfound skill. She found a treasure trove of letters from Louise Brooks to her friend and film archivist Herman G. Weinberg. These letters were written between December 1962, when she was 56 and beginning an enormously satisfying literary career, and October 1983, by which point she had chronic emphysema and was unable to type. The library gave Lee a lot less latitude with these letters. No duplication was permitted. No pens were permissible. So, Lee took extensive notes from the letters, which were usually typed on plain paper. After weeks of assiduous attention to the letters, Lee felt she had a strong familiarity with the passionate Louise Brooks, who was a silent film star turned cranky critic of movies and movie stars. Lee knew she would need old paper for the Louise Brooks letters, and while researching Maddie Christian's, she found bulky, loose-leaf books, which had a plentiful amount of blank paper weathered by time in the back of the book. It would be perfect for the Louise letters. Obtaining convincing paper for her letters could have possibly been the most difficult part of Lee's mission. For subjects who use personalized stationery, she would simply take a sample of the letterhead, which she duplicated at the library, and have it duplicated at the printer. Signatures would require artful practice. Lee would copy a signature by tracing it through the lightest weight paper she could find. Then Lee would take the signature home and practice it over and over again, but it never exactly matched. Lee took her old Sears Roebuck black and white TV and laid it on its back and used the light emitted from the electron tube to create a light box. She could then simply trace the signature precisely. It was content style and humor that sold the fake letters. Creating the phony Brooks letters, Lee cobbled together paragraphs from several real letters, then mixed and matched them, and then Lee rewrote the letters in the style of the subject. She professed that she had a fear of these signature dealers schmoozing with one another and comparing works, and that she would be discovered. She did use certain verbatim sentences, the one she judged as just too good to be altered. Lee also did not date any of her letters, a ploy to make sure there would be no chronological gotcha moment. Of the approximately 400 fake letters Lee wrote from April 1990 until the summer of 1991, only the Louise Brooks letters were constructed of actual letters. All of Lee's other letters were based on biographical data gleaned from various sources. Dorothy Parker's epistolary legacy was a bit scarce. However, Dorothy Parker would make Lee quite a bit of money. In one of Dorothy's letters, she wrote, "Dear Joshua, Alan told me to write and apologize, so I'm doing that now while he dresses for our turkey dinner with the boys across the road. I have a hangover that is a real museum piece. I am sure then that I must have said something terrible. To save me this kind of exertion in the future, I'm thinking of having little letters run off saying, 'Can you ever forgive me? Dorothy.' Signed, 'Can you ever forgive me? Dorothy.'" In this letter, the line, "Can you ever forgive me?" is Lee's. The hangover line is actually Dorothy's. Lee would have had most fun playing Noel Coward. Noel Coward was an English playwright, composer, director, actor, and singer known for his wit, flamboyance, and that Time magazine called a sense of personal style, a combination of cheek and chic, pose and poise. And Lee wrote her Noel letters with the same flamboyant flair, full of colloquialisms and jaunty sayings that may be in fashion at the time. Lee's letters were taken to be the real thing by editor Barry Day, a longtime student of Noel Coward's life, and they were included in the 2007 book, The Letters of Noel Coward. For Lee, this was a hoot, and also a terrific compliment. Lee discovered a batch of letters by Clara Blandick. She is the actress who played Auntie M in The Wizard of Oz. Blandick's life came to a sad end when, sick and impoverished, she swallowed a bunch of pills and then tied her head inside of a plastic bag. Oz stuff is famously prized among memorabilia enthusiasts. Blandick's value had increased due to her death, and an online auctioneer described her signature as the Holy Grail of Oz autographs. Lee did not make many Blandick letters, but those she did sold well. Lee wrote about 10 Lillian Hillman's letters, which were based mostly on letters sent to her from Lily Hillman's in a response to when Lee was writing the biography on Tallulah Bankhead and had asked for an interview. The two had performed together in The Little Foxes on Broadway. But Hillman's was a difficult woman and she turned down the interview request. At this point, Lee had sold her bogus letters to around 30 dealers nationwide. One of the out-of-town dealers left Lee a voicemail asking to be called back. Lee immediately called them back from a bar in Greenwich Village called 88's. He told her about two of his clients who were ecstatic about the Louise Brooks letters. The man went on about his pleasure in dealing with autographs and memorabilia since his retirement. Lee casually asked him what he had done before retiring. "Oh, I was an FBI guy," the man said. Several weeks later, a different dealer took Lee out to dinner at an Italian restaurant. The dinner had been arranged to thank her for the healthy profits he was making in the sales of Lee's stuff to other dealers. During the dinner, he told Lee, "We're having a problem with some of the West Coast dealers. One of the dealers out there tried to sell some Noel cowards to a man who knew Noel well enough to realize that he would have never revealed so much in a letter, certainly not about his sexuality. Coward lived in a time when homosexuality was still a jailing offense." They finished dinner and Lee drank a second Remy, which was served in a goblet which could have held a dozen roses. Her dining companion mentioned another dealer in New York with whom he had discussed more of Lee's letters. "They're real, if we say they're real," he said. Lee made no admissions of guilt. But after this, the heat was on. At memorabilia shows on the West Coast, one dealer would go from booth to booth, exclaiming, "Fake, fake, fake." And radio commentator Paul Harvey stated on his show, "Look for a shakeup very soon now in the autograph field." Lee knew he had to be talking about her. And then there was a column by Cindy Adams. To collectors like Dick Cavett, who owns Louise Brooks memorabilia, a clutch of bogus celebrity letters, possibly including Dorothy Parker notes, may be around. Be careful. Lee was at the post office when the voice of Alan Weiner, owner of the Academy bookstore, appeared on her message service. Alan was a nervous man in his late 40s. During deals, they always sat on milk cartons in the back of his store. Alan asked if Lee would be willing to sell him all of her Dorothy Parker letters. He wanted to corner the market. Lee went home and composed about 8 Dorothy Parker letters to Alan's delight. But now, on her message service, Alan did not sound delighted. He wanted to meet Lee as soon as possible for a drink. The two met at a bar and had a conversation in whispered tones, even though they were the only 2 customers in the place. Alan told her that he had been called to testify before a New York State grand jury, convening to target Lee Israel. Alan said that his testimony could be critical, and he wanted $5,000 to help her. Lee told him that she was expecting a royalty check soon and would pay him upon receipt of that check. This was a lie. There was no royalty check. Lee hadn't received any royalties from her books in years. About a month before all of this bad news started, Lee had received a letter on cheap lined paper and an odd return address. It was from her old friend, Jack Hawk. She had dismissed him from her life, like everyone else she had known years previously. Jack was a tall, gay man in his early 40s, though he lied about his age all of the time. The letter he had sent was from prison. Jack got himself into trouble quite often and took many severe beatings from hustlers, whose services Jack had used, but he was unable to pay for. But each time he got knocked down, he got right back up and had himself improved. New teeth from New York University, for example. He was a chain smoker, and despite a touch of wayward charm, he was a grifter at heart. Lee and Jack had become fast friends, and she was attempted to protect him from his other friends, who weren't much smarter than he was. Their friendship had ended when Lee found out that Jack was still shopping her Tallulah book as a screenplay long after his option had expired. He had even forged Lee's name to extend his option, and at that, he had misspelled Lee's name on the paperwork. According to the prison letter Lee received, he would soon be out on probation because he contracted AIDS. Lee called and offered to take Jack for lunch the next day at the Ginger Man. During this lunch, Jack spent most of the time proclaiming his innocence. Then he cried tears because he hadn't been allowed to attend his father's funeral. Over their BLTs, Lee told Jack about her life of crime so far. Jack covered his mouth with his hand and giggled away, completely astounded by Lee's career as a forger. Lee told him that she could no longer show her face around town, that she couldn't continue with the forgeries, and that she needed $5,000. But she had a plan, and it included him. Lee intended to tour some major university libraries, replicate some valuable letters in their collections, then replace the real letters with her forged copies. She would then give Jack the originals to take around and sell to the New York dealers. Jack would get 50%. Jack was in. Lee started making a fake book contract, which would gain her access to most protected areas of the libraries. In her first few visits, she faked working on anything. She was truly there to surveil the security at each location. She would choose a couple of letters and would copy them word for word, comma for comma, noting spacing, indentation, type, and paper size. Then carefully, she would trace the signature. She would then go home or to her hotel room if she was out of town and painstakingly recreate the letter. The following day, she would return to the library and request the same box. She would replace the original letter with her own and hide the original in her shoe. Only once, at Princeton, did she come close to being caught. Between February and July 1992, Lee visited Yale, Penn State, Syracuse, Cornell, and back to Lincoln Center. She even visited Harvard and the Haggard Library in Athens, Georgia, which holds many of Margaret Mitchell's highly valued letters. Lee had to rent a space on Amsterdam Avenue to hold all of her various vintage typewriters. Each was tagged with which putative owner's name: Edna, Noel, Dorothy, Clara Blandick, Huxley, Brooks, Eugene O'Neill. Jack didn't share with Lee what story he had concocted to sell the letters. She had allowed Jack to go alone to do his deals and then return to Lee's apartment, where they would split the money 50-50. But grifters' habits die hard, and on one day, upon returning from selling a couple of Margaret Mitchells, Jack gave Lee $750, half of what he claimed he had been paid. Lee, being suspicious, asked Jack to see the other half of the money, to which he handed her $1,250. Jack tried to make an excuse, but this was the last time Lee let him go on a sale by himself. Because Lee couldn't show her face, she would wait for Jack just around the corner from the sale, at a bar or a cafe. And Jack fell ill from time to time with AIDS-related ailments. But when he was well, the pair continued with their money-making endeavors. On July 27, 1992, around noon, Lee was waiting on Jack at a fancy kosher deli. It seemed to be taking longer than normal for the sale to happen, So after finishing her pastrami on rye, Lee thought maybe Jack misunderstood and headed back to Lee's apartment after the sale. She left the deli, hooding her eyes from the midday sun. A man walked up to her and called out Lee, not in a questioning way. "We'd like to talk to you," said the FBI agent. He told her that they had cornered Jack as he had arrived at one of the dealers who had become a cooperating witness in their investigation. The agent told her that Jack had told them names of colleges primarily. There were no Miranda rights read, and neither Lee nor Jack was arrested. But the FBI agent told Lee that Jack requested she not try to telephone or harass him in any way. Lee bought an enormous bottle of scotch on her way home and sat in her apartment drinking directly from the bottle, while, hands shaking, she shredded pounds of notes and unused stationery. She put the shredded paper into multiple hefty bags and left the bags in various trash cans around her neighborhood. She disposed of her bank of typewriters one by one in trash cans along a mile stretch of Amsterdam Avenue, all the while watching to make sure she wasn't being surveilled by the FBI. It had been one of the dealers who had made the first call to the FBI, and another dealer who alerted them to the imminent sale visit by Jack. The agents had followed Jack on July 21st after a sale and observed his meeting with Lee in a tourist trap bar at the bottom of the Empire State Building. Developing a case against Lee was like shooting fish in a barrel. On every trip to the libraries, she had correctly identified herself. Lee and Jack received subpoenas separately, and Lee was directed to produce documents for a federal grand jury. She was also instructed not to destroy any evidence, which had already been destroyed and spread throughout her neighborhood for the garbage collectors. Lee began shopping around for an attorney, but after a few false starts, she ended up with a lawyer through the Federal Defenders Program. Many of the things Lee feared the most never came to pass, which were mostly dignity issues. She was always treated respectfully. She was never arrested, nor made to do a perp walk. She was never placed into a cell or handcuffed. The FBI was only interested in conspiracy to transport stolen property in interstate commerce, a Class D felony. Lee was out of sorts and crazed by the thought of doing any jail time. One night, drunk and unable to sleep, Lee shoplifted a $3.95 bottle of Sominex from a local Pricewise, and she was taken away in handcuffs and a squad car. She continued to be completely obnoxious by correcting the cops' grammar on their trip to the station house. After spending some time in a cell, Lee showed up to the criminal court building in Lower Manhattan for her hearing. The store did not show up to the hearing, so all charges were dropped, and Lee's judicial virginity remained intact. A good thing for her felony case, as judges looked down on repeat offenders. Before her trial, Lee did the usual good deeds ordered by a sharp defense attorney. She did community service. She worked at the Museum of Natural History, helping to prepare a new guide for guests. And her attorney wrote letters to the court, stressing her distinguished past and the bad part of her past which drove her to a life in crime. Lee had drawn Judge Robert W. Sweet, who was a respected jurist who had spoken out against draconian and inflexible laws applied to the so-called war on drugs. The judge asked her if in the last 20 hours she had used drugs, pills, or alcohol, anything that would have affected her ability to understand what was going on. Lee was sentenced to 5 years probation and 6 months house arrest. She wasn't to leave the state or consort with felons, and she had to pay restitution within her means. The judge directed her to attend AA meetings, which she never did. Jack was sentenced to 3 years probation, but died October 1994. He was 47 years old. Lee and Jack never saw one another again after they had been caught. Lee suffered and paid by being barred from the libraries that she had stolen from. Lee's guilt over the original thefts was mitigated somewhat by the gathering of the dispersed letters. Lee cooperated with the FBI, and the real letters were recovered and returned to their archival homes. Lee said that she was a better writer as a forger than she had ever been as a writer. Not long after her probation ended, she found a staff position copy editing the classroom magazines at Scholastic. Lee Israel died in New York City on December 24, 2014, from myeloma. According to a New York Times obituary, she had lived alone and had no children. In 2017, a biopic of Lee Israel was filmed starring Melissa McCarthy as Israel. Melissa McCarthy was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actress for her portrayal. And here we are, at the end of another case. Feel free to contact us on our social media to let us know how you feel about Lee Israel's misdeeds and transgressions. Until next time, I'm John Dodson, and this has been The Secret Sits. Audio engineering by Gabriel Dodson. Original artwork provided by Tony Lay.